Hello, welcome everybody. Mike Jacob, corresponding secretary of the Society. Welcome to our new season, a 24-25 season of Wednesday webinars. And to kick it off, we're delighted to have Dan Jaffe Wilder, who's the Director of Applied Ecology at the Norcross Wildlife Foundation in Massachusetts. And tonight's topic is building resilient landscapes, which should be pretty fascinating. Dan, take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Pleasure talking to you all. I love seeing these numbers in this participants category. This is absolutely fantastic. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dan Wilder. I'm the Director of Applied Ecology for the Norcross Wildlife Foundation. I've spent the past 15, going on 18 years now, working in some version of native plant horticulture, ecology. I got my first kicks on a mow and blow crew, planting burning bush and spreading red mulch and pruning things into meatballs and rocket chips. And then from there, started learning what to do right. Spent 10 years at Garden in the Woods in Framingham, Mass. Before taking my current position at the Norcross Wildlife Foundation. 30 seconds on Norcross. We're not exactly sure what we are. We're kind of a land trust. We're kind of a wildlife foundation. We manage about 8,400 acres in South Central Mass, North Central Connecticut. We have a nice long mission statement, which is frankly a lovely mission statement. It's way too long. It boils down to we build habitat. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. Today is building resilient landscapes. And this is, the running joke is all my lectures are really just about building habitat. But this one is a real focus on trying to build resiliency into the landscape, build sustainability into the landscape, build a landscape that can withstand the challenges of the day, whether that be, a changing climate or invasive species or, kind of a noisy, lawn-loving neighbor. Whatever it might be, we're trying to build landscapes that can kind of support an ecosystem, but also deal with the challenges of the modern world, which varies greatly depending on where you are and who you are and what you're dealing with. So with that in mind, let's dig right into this. We're going to talk, I'm known very much as a native plant guy. We're going to talk a little bit about what we actually mean by native and why that matters. I tend to really prefer to take this in a practical direction instead of arguing semantics. Whether you are doing restoration work or whether you're doing home landscape work or whether you're in a community garden, you're probably dealing with weeds. The weeds may vary from site to site, but the challenge is the same. And there's a couple strategies that are really effective for dealing with weeds. I don't think I've got a lecture these days that doesn't involve a little bit of, degrading the kind of the traditional American lawn and talking about some possible better alternatives for lawns, of which there are many. We're going to talk about plants. A large portion, if you want 10 more seconds of listening to me and then go home for the night and feel like you got the message, best way to build resiliency into the landscape is to build diversity into the landscape. I was joking before we even got started. When I'm building a new landscape, I'll plant 50 species, expecting only 25 of them to make it in the long run. And the idea is that I'm just throwing all of these different options at an area, knowing that if one of them doesn't work, another one will. And that in time, as a landscape matures and as management kind of becomes, settles or maybe doesn't, depending on your landscape, you will find species that work well for you. That doesn't work so well when you've just got a swath of maybe one or two plants. It does work well when you've got 15 or 20. I think a great way to end the day, especially this time of year, is to talk a little bit about garden cleanup. When I was on my mow and blow cruise, kind of planting invasive species, I did a lot of garden cleanup. And frankly, a lot of it was a good way to take money out of people's pockets, but really was no favor to them in terms of taking care of their landscape. So I do apologize. We're going to start the lecture off with doom and gloom. I promise we'll get uplifting right after this. But I want to start by talking about why I choose to work with native plants. By really any measure, we are in what we could call a biodiversity crisis. Depending on kind of who you talk to, you might hear different numbers or different, kind of arguments or different aspects to focus on. But across the board, we're looking at some troubling things. We've got about 40% of the global insect species that are in decline. We're looking at bird species in decline. These two are intricately linked. A large portion of birds' diets is insects, so it makes sense when you're losing food, you're going to lose, the animal that's eating the food. In the past 50 years, we've lost 68 vertebrate species. That's a lot of species. That's more than one a year lost, gone extinct, not coming back. We lose 13 million hectares of forest every year. That's the size of Greece on an annual basis. That is a lot of forest lost. It's an ironic sort of, number because in some areas we are seeing forests, bouncing back and rejuvenating. Unfortunately, what seems to be happening is the areas where the forests are needed the most are the ones that are losing it the most. I don't have New Jersey numbers, but I do have Massachusetts numbers. These are a little out of date, but they still put the idea home. In the last 5 years, this is probably now 3 years old. So in 5 years, 3 years ago, we lost 25,000 acres to development in Massachusetts. I'm not as upset about that number as I am about this second number. The 9,300 acres of high priority conservation land, which was lost, is the real concern in my book. It's not a realistic thing to say we should stop developing or that we could just put all of the landscape that's left undeveloped, aside for conservation. It's a beautiful dream, but it's a dream. It's not something that's ever going to happen. So I don't find myself taking the stance of anti-development. Instead, what I think is the correct stance, at least for me, is smart development. If we are going to be developing, if we're going to be building house lots, if we're going to be cutting down forests, let's not be doing it on high priority conservation land. That is not smart development. So what do we do about all of these issues? I kind of, think globally, think locally. I try and work to support regional land conservation. This is not something that any one person can do on their own, but it's something that any one of us can be involved with. This might be as complicated as you going out and kind of volunteering your time and restoring landscapes and so forth, or it might just be a much simpler thing. Get to know your local land trust. I think that is a phenomenal place to start. When you've got the ability to throw some money at organizations that you think are doing good work. I think most of these organizations would fit you guys in Jersey, but the ones that come to my mind are folks like the Audubon Society, the Nature Conservancy, the Trustees of Reservations, which I'm pretty sure doesn't get into Jersey, but I'm sure you have a similar organization. When in doubt, look up what the land trust is working in your region. If there's not one, think about starting one if you got the time. And then on the local side, build habitat. And this means planting native plants. This might mean removing invasive species. This might mean, kind of restoring waterways. But when in doubt, stick a native plant in the ground somewhere and you are building local habitat. Don't have ground to plant it and stick a native plant in a pot. A bee balm in the pot on the, porch looks lovely. And it builds habitat. Every little bit counts. So, a tale of two geraniums. On the left is the garden geranium. This is not a native species. This is a common annual species. You could find it at just about every garden center that I've ever been to. On the right is the wild geranium. This is one of our native species. This is native to Mass, native to Jersey, native to pretty much the whole East Coast. Well, maybe not very far south, but it's up and down the eastern coastline. And when I start looking at species and trying to figure out what are they doing on the landscape, I look at interactions. So when I look at these plants, I will find the European honeybee visiting either one of them. Notice the name, European honeybee. This is not a native bee. This is the bee that we raise in colonies, that we get honey from. I tend to think of these bees the same way I think of my chickens. These are a domesticated animal. This is not the same as, say, a wild pollinator. When we hear the kind of Save the Pollinators campaign, we tend to be thinking about, native bees, butterflies, various other animals. This one kind of sits aside. Not to say it's not important. I love honey. That being said, this is a bit of a different species. This is Bombus impatiens. This is a native insect. This is the most common native bumblebee in our entire region, pretty much, again, running up and down the East Coast. If you don't know your bumblebees, and that's me, I don't really know my bumblebees well, and you see something that flies by you that's fuzzy and yellow with some black on it, point and say bombus and patience, you'll be right at least half the time. Both of these insects, our native bumblebee and the European honeybee are generalist feeders. They're happy to feed on the garden geranium, the wild geranium, and just about any other flower that they can find. That, however, is where the value of the garden geranium tends to end. You will never see mining bees visiting the non-native geranium, nor sun moths, white-lined sphinx moths, purple-lined sun moths, white-marked tussock moths, or all of these other species. It's just kind of the value of native plants. They produce a lot of sites for additional animals to feed upon them. We've got all of these different butterflies that are mostly feeding in a caterpillar form, our butterflies and moths, but then we've got these beetles, these pollinated flies, a variety of different bees, including specialist bees. And this is not an argument not to plant the geranium on the left. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not an invasive species. It's not causing, issues on the landscape. If you maybe cleared the entire native landscape out and planted nothing but, garden geranium, that might be a bit of a problem, but I don't think that's very realistic. So if you like the garden geranium, go ahead and plant it. Maybe try and stick a few of these, native wild geraniums on your landscape as well, and then you get the best of both worlds. I find in many cases, you don't need to go 100%. If you want to, I will support you every step of the way. But you can plant your garden geranium. You can grow your tomatoes. You can grow your rosemary. The one plant I'm going to tell you not to plant is the invasive species. And I might get on your case if you got a giant, lawn and nothing else on the landscape. But as long as you're putting native plants in the ground and trying to encourage that sort of planting mindset, then you are going to be building habitat where you're working. We have some amazing native plants in our flora, about 2,500 species growing absolutely everywhere. Pincushion plant, the guy on the right here, you'll see growing on the top of Mount Washington. 200-mile-per-hour winds, very little soil, amazing conditions that plants like this thrive in. The cool thing about our flora is we have such a diverse flora that there are a number of phenomenal native plants that work very well in built landscapes and once established require almost nothing from us. There are plants like the yellow plume grass that will grow in the sandiest, sunniest, driest, kind of thinnest soil environments and do not need watering or fertilizer or mowing. These plants just survive perfectly fine in those tough conditions on their own. No need to amend your soil. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got something like maple leaf viburnum, which will flower and produce fruit and produce fall foliage in the densest shade that my area has to offer. Hard to find a shrub that does all of those things in dense shade. This one will even do it in dry acidic shade, which is a tough spot to fill. It's kind of amazing. We don't have 2,500 species that'll do well in the garden, but in those 2,500 species, there are plenty that will do well no matter how difficult your planting conditions are. It all boils down to you end up having to do less to make these plants successful, and in the meantime, these plants are producing life. What we've got here is the little bit of a leaf of Chelone glaber, the white turtlehead. And what you're looking at there is the chrysalis of the Baltimore checker spot. There was a caterpillar in there. It went in there as a caterpillar. It emerged as a butterfly. By the time I found this, it was already flying around, and I spotted the chrysalis. Cool thing, that. So then the big question is, what do we actually mean by native? This question seemed so simple until I actually looked into it and tried to define it and realized that there's as many native definitions out there as there are species of carex, at 153 in my state at least. More often than not, I don't even bother with the question of what is native. I find that often it gets into semantical arguments. Is this plant native to this state? Is it native to this county? Is it native to this political region? Is this plant migrating? It's complicated. Life is complicated. More often than not, I find myself asking, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish on this site? And for me, that usually means building habitat. And building habitat predominantly means planting native plants, but the goal is not to plant native plants. The goal is to build habitat. If Japanese knotweed produce great habitat, then I'd plant Japanese knotweed, but it doesn't, so we don't. But it means that I can kind of get away from the argument as to whether or not this plant is native enough and look at what is it doing on the landscape. Is it producing habitat? In which case, it's native enough for me. Talame and Dark did this in a book called The Living Landscape. This is not a new concept, but it's kind of a comparison to the traditional definitions of native. What they did is they called for complex and essential relationships. Something like this spicebush swallowtail we can see here on the right. That is an insect that feeds on spicebush and sassafras and I think tulip tree, and those alone. And that is both a complex and an essential relationship. It's a very different relationship as the, Bombus impatiens feeding on the garden geranium, or for that matter, the European honeybee feeding on the purple loosestrife. What we've got in the case of the swallowtail is a species, a caterpillar that is entirely reliant on a small list of plant species. And we've got those list of plant species that are benefiting from the presence of this caterpillar, while at the same time it's eating its leaves. It's an important pollinator. It's also an important source of food. I root for the caterpillar to become a butterfly. I also root for the bird to find the caterpillar and eat it. And now we've got an ecosystem starting to build. So I'm a numbers guy. Numbers really help me to kind of figure out these complicated, sort of questions. So let's start looking at plants. These first two plants, black willow and wild strawberry, are both native, no matter how you define native. So traditional definitions are something to the extent of a plant is native if it was present in New Jersey before European settlement. Black willow is on that list, wild strawberry is on that list. Both of these support a huge amount of Lepidoptera. Those are the caterpillars that form, butterflies and moths. We tend to focus on Lepidoptera for, frankly, two big reasons. The biggest one is likely that we have the data. This is Doug Talame's work and a variety of other folks as well, his grad students and others. But he's great at providing information to us. And we know that black willow supports 399 different Lepidoptera. Having data is useful. We can use it. The other half of this is that, as I mentioned a moment ago, those butterflies and moths are really important food sources for other animals on the landscape. Whether that be birds or whether that be, animals that eat birds and animals that eat the animals that eat birds, or whether it be the rabbits or the, you name it. Caterpillars are, frankly, little crawling sacks of protein, a really good food source for a lot of different animals. So we tend to pay attention to them. 399 species on a tree is extremely impressive. Top of the list are the oaks. They're around, the high 400s. So being, right around 400 is a very, very impressive number. We ought to be using more black willows on the landscape. It's not a great tree for most gardens, but if you got a spot for it, it's worth looking into. Wild strawberry, 87 species supported, definitely a lower number than our trees, but for herbaceous plants, that is about the top of the list. In fact, it's second top of the list. The goldenrods do beat them out. But wild strawberries support a huge amount of life. And it's not even for the strawberries. Those are nice too. It also means that I can eat every strawberry I see and still know that wild strawberry plant is producing a ton of ecosystem functions. Looking at some other native plants, wild bergamot, less Lepidoptera supported, some really important bee interactions on wild bergamot. Red trillium doesn't seem to be doing all that much on the landscape. That either means that it's not doing all that much on the landscape, or that we don't fully understand what it is doing on the landscape. I think it's likely a combination of both things. Not every plant is going to be as supportive as the next, and anyone who tells you we've got it all figured out is trying to sell you something. This is where it starts to get a little more interesting. This is the gray zone. Malus coronaria, this is native for you guys, but in my region, this is a plant that many people would not label as a native species. And yet that number, 293, is based on my zip code. That's Brimfield, Massachusetts. 293 species being supported by a tree that many people call non-native. And this is really where the idea of defining native based on political lines doesn't really make a lot of sense. This is a plant that we could call native to the New England ecoregions. We can call it native to the Northeast, or we can just say that this is a plant that is supporting enough habitat and enough life that I don't care whether you want to call it a native or not. It's a fantastic native apple tree. Shrubby St. John's wort. This one's actually rare in Jersey. It's non-existent in New England. It gets into New York, so I guess we could argue it as a Northeastern native. But this is one that I've been in arguments with people telling me that it's not native and I should stop planting it. And I tell them it supports 22 Lepidoptera and a huge amount of specialist bees. It produces habitat. So whether or not it's native, I don't really care. It's a good habitat plant. And this is often how I'm thinking in many landscapes, not all of them. If we're working on a restoration in a pine barren, I'm probably going to be planting plants that are much more, kind of representative of the pine barrens of my region. But if I'm talking about building out, a parking lot island or a home garden or my roadside, that's where a shrubby St. John's wort is a fantastic species. And then comparing it to just solidly non-native plants, no matter how you define native, ginkgo, boxwood, forsythia, and butterfly bush are not native by any definition. Lepidoptera supported is between 1 and 0. The one that is happy to feed on ginkgo is a generalist. It'll feed on just about any other tree it gets near. I always like to point out the fact that butterfly bush supports 0 caterpillars. We tend to, hear a lot about butterfly bush being so good for butterflies. It's often described as empty calories. You will get butterflies visiting those flowers. They will get nectar out of them, but that shrub supports nothing in terms of the specialized interactions between the earlier life stages, the caterpillar and the host plant. It's also on the invasive list in a whole bunch of states, and not one that I would recommend people plant. So let's start getting into how we build a resilient garden. And the question here is, how many people got into gardening for love of mulch? The kind of question I'm getting at is, how resilient is mulch? What role should it be playing on the landscape? Because honestly, when I walk around, my landscape and I see gardens in my area, I say that about 95% of them are using mulch incorrectly. I look up pictures of gardens online, and this is what I get. There is more mulch in this garden than there are plants. I'm looking at a whopping 4 species in this area. There's a monoculture lawn. There's a variegated hosta. I've got a shrubby thing in back that I'm not sure what that is. That might be a Korean azalea. That might be a boxwood. That might be an ilex. Who knows? And maybe a peach tree behind it. This is an area that could have 50 species in it. First thing I would do is start removing the mulch. And this is common. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to be surprised by these pictures. We see this all over the place. We have gardens that are more mulch than plants. And this isn't to say that we need to necessarily clear this entire thing out and start all over again. This may not be my garden aesthetic, but if you don't mind the look of this, then what I would say is start pulling back that mulch and start planting some ground covers. And you've already made a huge step in the right direction for bringing diversity in the landscape, bringing resiliency in the landscape, building a soil and a food ecosystem that wildlife can thrive in. Wildlife don't tend to thrive in mulch. This is a picture from Norcross. This is the north side of a building. This area gets 0 direct light. That's a sugar maple. I've got a couple different asters in there and some carices. This is not a garden. This wasn't even planted. This is nature doing nature. This is the sort of area that in any other instance we would call a very difficult landscape. Compacted soil, 0 sun. And yet I've got a thriving population of whitewood aster there. This is the Martha's Vineyard Edgartown Public Library. Martha's Vineyard, for anyone unfamiliar with it, is an island off the coast of Mass. It is pretty much just a giant pile of sand. Not easy conditions to work with. And we have a thriving population of New Jersey. Sorry, not New Jersey. What is that plant? Sweet fern. It often grows well with New Jersey tea. That's where my brain was going. This is sweet fern. A lovely plant for a built landscape, especially on a retaining wall that's made to be sat on. When you rub up against this plant, it smells sweet, kind of cinnamon toast crunchy. Good choice for kind of a built landscape here, and definitely a good choice for sandy soils. This is my old stomping grounds. It's garden in the woods. Notice how the last 3 pictures didn't actually have any mulch in them. All 3 of them actually did, but you can't see it. The mulch is kind of disappearing under the plants because the plants are taking the major role, and the mulch is just a tool to get them established. Here's Norcross Wildlife Foundation. This is one of our garden areas. I've got running foam flower there, one of our yellow lady slippers, there's some Goldie's wood fern in back, and there is some leaf mulch underneath all of that. So what I'm getting at here is not a don't use mulch or stop using mulch or any sort of no mulch. What I'm getting at here is let's kind of think about what we're doing with mulch and how we could use it correctly and how that can relate to a more resilient garden space. What does mulch do for us? It actually does a lot of things. Controls weeds, retains moisture, prevents soil erosion. You can read it yourself. The fact is that established plants do all of those things better. They do every one of the things on this list, and they do it better than mulch does. So it's not a don't use mulch. It's that mulch is an important tool for young gardens, early spaces. It's a great tool for getting the plants established that will then do all of these things for us. I want mulch that will break down pretty quickly because I want my plants to take that place of mulch. If you have mulch that is, really holding its own for years on a time and still looks fresh, that means it's been treated. It's been treated with something to retard its breakdown, to keep that color in place, to stop it from breaking down. That's not a good thing. That means that it is not only controlling weeds, but it's controlling the spread of all the plants that you want on your landscape. Oftentimes, when I'm talking about mulch in the garden, I'm talking about combinations of compost, well-aged wood chips, and leaves. That's the sort of mulch that does break down and then leads the way to a picture like this on the right. I also like working with plants in place of mulch, what is often referred to as living mulch or kind of green cover. These are the plants that then take the place of the mulch after the mulch is gone. In some cases, if we're talking like a meadow situation, I'm just talking about bee bombs and goldenrods and asters and little blue stem and just about every plant you could think of. But for most garden settings where we want something a little more formalized, I tend to mean ground covers, something that stays low and acts as kind of the glue amongst those other kind of larger clumping plants. So what do we need for good living mulch? We need a balance. We need a balance between the spread of a plant and its ability to kind of play as a companion amongst other plants. So some goldenrods might work for this. This one would not. I love this plant. It's a great goldenrod, but it spreads way too strongly and doesn't have nearly the companionship that I'm looking for if we're talking about a living mulch situation. Something on the other end of the spectrum, these are the bluets, Quaker ladies, Houstonia, great companionship. This plant's happy to grow amongst anything. The problem is it doesn't really spread very vigorously, at least not in the way that I need it to for kind of a living mulch purpose. This one's great in between the walking, the stepping stones in your walkway. And then the final question is, how is the plant spreading? When we think about a ground cover, we often think about plants that spread via rhizomes or stolon, some sort of a colonizing species. But there's other ways as well. This is another picture of the geranium that we talked about previously, the wild geranium. That's it kind of sending off its seeds. It does these little catapults, shoot seeds off. So instead of spreading to form a patch in one area, this one's going to send out kind of new plants within a 5 or 6 foot radius. This is a useful thing to have. It's useful to have both in the garden, both the seed spreader and the kind of vegetative spreader. So foam flower is often one of my first kind of go-tos for this. Tiarella stolonifera is the running foam flower. There's another one, Tiarella cordifolia, that is a clumping species that is lovely, but doesn't work nearly as well as a living mulch. This plant is effective from an ornamental point of view, both in flower and in foliage. The leaves there are not a cultivated form. That's just a wild type that happened to show off really nicely. I started growing this one from seed about 10 years ago now and realized that there's a huge diversity in kind of forms within the genetics of this plant. And when you start collecting or growing or buying seed grown plants, you start getting this great calico effect of different kind of forms in it. This is a fantastic plant in terms of being a good spreader, but also a good companion. For anyone who's into growing lady slippers, you know that these things are, they're amazing plants, but they're not very good at holding their own against other pushy neighbors. So having a plant that can kind of spread around them, but also allow them to kind of grow up amongst them is really nice. And foam flower does that very well. Here's some pictures of those seed grown plants that I was talking about. Ranging from the kind of one, second from the right that looks kind of more like a standard, foam flower leaf, to varying forms of kind of, mottling and variegation and then cutting of the leaf and to some extent shininess. You also see some, less, but some variation within the flowers. Mostly in terms of like when they bloom, you'll get a few that bloom earlier than others. Some of them might have a little tinge of pink. Some of them might be a little bit taller or shorter. It's nice to see that variety in the garden setting. You start getting that kind of calico effect in the garden. We talked about kind of building, resiliency by planting diversity. Diversity means species, but it also means individuals. So if we're planting, 200 foam flower in the garden and they're all a cultivar that is all a clone of the same, variety, then we've in effect planted one individual 200 times. Much better to get some diversity of species and individuals into there. And that means either planting as many different cultivars as you can, or better yet, working with seed grown, wild type species that can provide all of that genetic diversity. Canada Mayflower, I feel like I'm the PR guy for Canada Mayflower. This is a plant that many of us have overlooked for a long, long time. This is a woodland understory species. It's one of the most common woodland understory species in the region. This is a plant that can scare people off at first because this one spreads very rapidly. What's nice about this is despite that rapid spread, that the plant only roots down at like 1/4 of an inch. It does not root deeply. And that means that just about every other plant around it can root below it and outcompete it pretty much in the root sphere. And this means that despite the spread on this one, it's still a great companion plant. It doesn't tend to take over areas unless the area is filled with really, really, really delicate things. This is it in a cultivated setting with a little more light and a little more nutrients, showing you what it can do when it's kind of taken outside of just the kind of wild areas. Here is it in 3 wild areas growing amongst 3 delicate species that it is happy to grow amongst. On the left there, we've got gold thread, which is a very delicate species, rare in some parts of this range. It seems to be outgrowing the myanthemum there. In the middle there, we got partridge berry, which despite being shorter than the Canada Mayflower, roots quite a bit lower than it is able to kind of get down and get the nutrients that the Canada Mayflower cannot. And then on the right side there, those kind of red leaves are the new leaves of Gaultheria procumbens, wintergreen. Technically a shrub, but only gets this tall. Lovely little thing that is not a fast grower, but is happy to grow right amongst Canada Mayflower. This plant doesn't get its due. Give it a try in your garden. It's well worth it. Last one before we move on to a different topic is the running groundsel, Pachyra obovata. I really like this species. It's one that I first learned about kind of in the garden settings. I find that I see Pachyra aurea, a different species, in the wild much more often. They're both great species. I think obovata might be a little bit of a better garden plant, and aurea is probably a better one for the slightly more naturalized areas. But they're both great. The foliage on it, I love these tinges of purple. You can see them kind of reflected in the early bloom. But then when it fully opens up, you just get these big, bright yellow kind of, happy sun sort of, flowers. A lovely species, a pretty good runner, one that's got some spreading potential. But again, it's one that works very well amongst other species. This one is very happy. It's actually very, very, dry soil tolerant, but where it's happiest is in moist soils. And if you plant this amongst, bee bombs and pie weeds and, the garden phlox and, plants like that, they're going to grow right up amongst it and it's just going to spread around the base. And when the flowers are in sign, they might all be the same size, but the foliage stays very low. Lovely species. Needs more attention. Here's it in the garden setting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about weeds. Everyone's got them. No one likes them. The question here is not a philosophical one. It is literally, where are the weeds coming from? In most cases, they're coming from above. They're coming from seeds that are either, floating around on the air or getting dropped out of the back end of the bird. And in some cases, they're coming out of the soil from the seeds that landed in the soil before we got started. But the idea is that there's always weed seeds coming down from above. If you had a magic wand and you could wave it and make every weed seed leave your garden, there's more coming in as soon as that wave ended. That means that this is useless. It's a really good way to put plastic in the landscape. It is a very good source of microplastics in the landscape, and it's a great way to, kind of get some money out of someone who comes into the garden center. But it's not very effective, at least not in the long run. It might smother things out initially, but afterwards, when you put down your mulch on top of it or your soil on top of it, the weed seeds land in that and start growing in it, and then you have weeds and plastic. So what I like to do is, knowing that seed is going to be landing in my landscape no matter what I do, I want to make sure that it is good seed. This is not going to be the end of weeds, but this means that instead of just getting a bunch of weeds in the garden, what I'm getting is weeds and columbine and various other things. And the way I do this is mostly by working with species that are very good at seeding around the landscape. And that tends to mean annuals and short-lived perennials. 3 native-ish annual species that I work with a lot Coreopsis tinctoria, sorry, Plains coreopsis on the left and partridge pea on the right are the two that I find myself working with by far the most. Partridge pea is kind of my go-to. Anytime I'm planting a new space that's not in dense shade, pretty much the last thing I'm doing is to overseed it, often with partridge pea and maybe other species as well, depending on the situation. The Plains coreopsis on the left there, excuse me, it's a lovely species. It's native a little bit further kind of west of my region, but it's native enough for my purposes. Got some great pollinator potential, easy to access. This is also one for anyone who happens to be, you know, into kind of dyeing and fiber arts. This is the one that's often referred to as dyer's coreopsis. Makes an absolutely lovely dye. And what I'll find myself doing is when I'm building a new landscape, you know, I'm planting my plugs, I'm planting my potted plants. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sow seed into that area in amongst all the plants that I just planted. And it might be as simple as just partridge pea, or it might be as complicated as partridge pea mixed with, you know, little blue stem and asters and goldenrods and 40 other species. But that means that I'm going to have this kind of growth, these nurse crops that start to grow as my plugs, my pots start to kind of get up and running. In addition to the annuals, I work with a lot of these kind of short-lived perennials. The nice thing about short-lived perennials is that the population is not necessarily going to be short-lived in the landscape. I've got Monarda punctata in places that I planted, you know, 15, 20 years ago. It's been there the whole time. The thing is, those plants that I first planted, they died 2 years after I planted them. These don't last very long on an individual basis, but what they're good at doing is producing a lot of seed. And then when the conditions are right, they drop their seed, the seed grows, and you've got new plants the next season and oftentimes for many years to come. Spotted bee balm is one of my go-tos for this. This is a phenomenal bee balm for sandy, dry sites. I find it's not one people know nearly as well as the scarlet bee balm or the wild bergamot. If you don't have the right soils for scarlet bee balm, if your soils are too dry, plant Monarda punctata. This is a fantastic plant. Wild columbine and black-eyed Susan, two additional species that I find myself working with somewhat regularly, especially the black-eyed Susan. That's in just about every one of my seed mixes. Another good one for kind of sandy, dry sites. Another one that, you know, many people are surprised to hear is kind of biennial, short-lived perennial, and one that will reseed into the landscape somewhat regularly, assuming there's some disturbance in the landscape. If the disturbance leaves the landscape, these things will often peter out and other species will take their place and become those long-lived plants in the landscape. I've always liked this picture. This is a picture from when I was at Garden in the Woods. What I always like to point out to people is we did not plant a single one of the black-eyed Susans in this picture. We built a new garden. There was black-eyed Susans about 150 yards to the left of this image, and the seed was in the seed bank. It was in the soil, and when we were digging in the soil and planting new plugs, we were disturbing the soil, bringing that seed to the surface, and the black-eyed Susan grew. And these become the weeds of your garden. Instead of it just being dock and chickweed and mullein, it's, you know, some dock, some chickweed, some mullein, and some black-eyed Susan, and some spotted bee balm, and some partridge pea. And with those plants, it's really more about editing than weeding. You kind of decide where they stay and where they go, leaning in the stay place in most cases. All right, let me check my time. 7:40, doing okay with time. I want to leave some time for questions. So how about this? I want to ask you, you know, I want you to build me a landscape. Tell me why it might make sense to try and plant a monoculture, a single species, of a non-native plant that doesn't produce food for me, doesn't produce ecosystem functions, and requires a ton of work in order to survive. Lawns don't really make a lot of sense, at least in many cases. You know, if you're running a farmer's market or you got a kid that plays soccer on the lawn, that might make some sense. But for the vast majority of us, we just have this lawn in front of our house because we frankly don't know what else to do with the space. I want to replace it. I want something different. I would love to say just build gardens, but if you've got a big lawn and you turn that entire thing into a garden, you got a lot of work in front of you. So it's not necessarily always just build more gardens. So what about a better version of a lawn? I want a lawn that requires no supplemental water, doesn't ever need fertilizer, will feed wildlife instead of being the death of wildlife, doesn't ever require pesticides or herbicides, you know, see note above, and tolerates foot traffic in at least 50, maybe more % of the situations we're talking about. In some cases, a lawn is purely aesthetic and it doesn't need to tolerate foot traffic. But in other cases, a lawn needs to be walked on. So we need species that can handle that. So I'm going to tell you to kill your lawn. Although I'll also mention that the one thing I really do love about lawns is that they are still plantable space. They're still a living space. They may not be a great space in their current form, but it's much easier to build something good out of a lawn than it is out of a parking lot. And then the question becomes, when I say kill your lawn, do I mean you got to get out there tomorrow and tear your entire lawn up and start all over again? And I find usually that's not the way to go about things. Those kind of, full-scale measures are tough to achieve correctly. More often than not, I say little steps is really the best way to go. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. I kind of call these the gradients of ecology, and there's an entire 3-hour lecture based on these. But for today, what I'm getting at here is kind of on the top of that list. That should frankly be the bottom of the list, is what we'll describe as the perfect lawn. Imagine that perfect golf course style lawn. Very, very low cut, all one species, beautifully green, perfect lawn. And that sort of lawn is directly harming the ecosystem. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got rewilding into something that is not a lawn at all anymore. You've taken your lawn and you've built a forest out of it. Probably not a very realistic situation for most people when they're looking at their lawn. Living somewhere in the middle is where most people end up finding themselves. And that might just mean treating your traditional lawn a little more sustainably, or that might mean planting a native lawn or some version of that in between. There's a lot of good options. There are some entirely non-native lawn options out there that are frankly phenomenal steps in the right direction and very good kind of sustainable options. Eco lawn, eco grass, no-mow lawn, low-mow lawn. You hear these under a variety of different names. They're pretty much all different versions of cool season fescues. Cool season fescue means it grows in the cool season. You'll hear warm season grasses in cool season, and the season we're referring to is a season of growth. The nice thing about growing in the spring and the fall, and therefore not growing in the summer, is you're growing when things tend to be moist, but also when things are cooler. So growth is slower. And this means that you don't have the need to be mowing all summer long when the warm season grasses are going nuts. So what these eco lawns do for us is they pretty much reduce the maintenance required for lawn care down to a much, much, much lower level. This is not necessarily building great habitat, but it is greatly reducing the harm of a standard lawn. Mowing is usually done once to twice a year. Basically just follow the directions on the pack. After establishment, these areas do not need water. Fertilizer is actually quite bad for them. It tends to encourage the weeds and not necessarily the fescues. And two of these that I've worked with success is Ecolawn through Prairie Moon and Ecograss through Wildflower Farm. But there's 100 different versions of them out there these days. And as I said, they're all very similar. White clover lawns are also a popular option these days. These are, this white clover is, again, it's not a native species. And in many cases, the white clover lawn is approaching a monoculture, which is not great. That being said, for a non-native monoculture, white clover is about as good as it gets. It does produce some nectar for bumblebees. It's not producing any kind of specialist bee habitat, but white clover is not a bad option. It grows well in a variety of conditions, including some shade. It's adaptable to most of the standard kind of lawn situations that a lot of people are dealing with. And the nice thing about both of these options is they're cheap, readily available, and established pretty quickly. And that's your advantages, time and cost. The downside to these is really the ecological side of things. These are definitely a step in the right direction, a great reduction in the harm of traditional lawns, but we're not really building ecosystems with these. Again, I will support anyone who wants to do these. This is such a good option. We could also do a bit better. We can start looking at native species. Carex pennsylvanica, the Pennsylvania sedge, this is a native, it's a sedge technically, not a grass, but who cares? It looks like a grass to me. This is a rhizomatous spreader. It's one that grows well in shade or sun. It's one that will fill into areas as, so you could go dig a hole in the middle of this and it'll fill right back in. That's what I mean by rhizomatous spreader. It also makes a nice little edge plant in garden settings. You can see it here growing underneath the asters on the edge of a trail at Garden in the Woods. Flowers in spring, not, showy flowers like the aster is, but interesting in their own way. and very densely shade tolerant. In fact, it does, as well in shade as it does in the sun. The one thing it doesn't want is full sun kind of dry soils. I got other options for those sites. But full sun with some richness in the soil or quite a bit of shade, and this one's good. For many people, if you've got a kind of trees in your lawn and it gets a little thin under the trees, that's often a great place to start. Kind of kill a little bit of lawn under the trees, start working the Carex pennsylvanica, see what you think of it, and go from there. Downside to this one, it's costly and it takes a while. This is not a fast spreader. It will fill in. The slowness of it means that the mowing needs on this one are little to none. You mow it pretty much often enough so that it doesn't turn into a meadow or a forest. Usually once a year for most people, but frankly, you could usually get away with once every 2 or 3 years. But a tray of plugs, $1.90 a plug, that gets expensive pretty quickly. And this is not one that we could buy as seed and just throw down on the landscape. So ecological value, significantly higher than our previous options. Get about 34 different native caterpillars that will feed on the leaves of this species. You even get some bee interactions on those flowers, despite them being predominantly wind pollinated. But there is a lot of ecological value on this. 34 is a pretty impressive number, especially for a plant that doesn't, attract pollinators in the sort of standard sense of the word. My personal favorite, wild strawberries. This plant, as we talked about earlier, supports 87 different caterpillars in our region, produces nice flowers in spring, produces a berry in the summertime that is edible to us, as well as the chipmunks and the birds and anyone else who visits the garden. This one's quite a bit faster to fill in than the Carex pennsylvanica. This picture here is right after, kind of maybe a month or two after I planted this area. You can see plenty of space in between those plants. This is a very young lawn. This is the very next spring. You can still see a little bit of space in between the plants, but not a lot, and a whole lot of flowers. And by that fall, it's fully filled in and looking fantastic, if I don't say so. Great fall color on this one if it's got good sunlight. And of course, it produces a ton of food. You don't see it, obviously, if you're not really looking closely at it, but look closely at this image and you're going to see some ratty leaves in there. You're going to see some leaves with holes in them. You're going to see some leaves with chewed edges. That's what this plant is doing on the landscape. It's providing leaves as a food source for a ton of different caterpillars. And then those caterpillars are eaten by the birds. And we start building an ecosystem out of what was previously just a lawn. Third one that I've been working with a lot, I actually like this one as a matrix species in amongst others, because we're talking about single species here, but there's nothing saying we can't start mixing things. Prunella vulgaris subspecies lanceolata, sometimes called lance-leafed self-heal or the American self-heal. This is our native subspecies of self-heal, also sometimes called heal-all. Long history of herbal use on this one. Quite a good plant to drink as a tea. Also quite a nice plant to kind of incorporate into a lawn mix setting. It's a native member of the mint family. Pretty short one. Can handle quite a bit of foot traffic, which is something the wild strawberry is very good at, and the Carex is not as good at. But this is a species I've been working with over the past couple of years. I was turned on to this one by some bee researchers who have been studying this plant as being a huge supporter of some rare bumblebees in the region. Bumblebees that feed upon this plant appear to be better able to resist some of the diseases within the bee world. It's not fully understood, but it appears to help them regulate their gut flora, and that makes for a healthy bee. So I decided to start growing more of it and realized that it actually makes a really lovely lawn plant. This is a 2-year-old lawn at Norcross. We planted these plugs pretty closely. I think if you wanted to save some money, you could definitely space them out more than we did and probably look at, 2 years and the fall, and it would look like this, or the following season it would look filled in. And this works quite nicely, either as kind of a single species, or better yet, mixed in with things like wild strawberry, maybe Canada mayflower, maybe Carex pennsylvanica, maybe purple lovegrass. We can really start talking about a matrix when we get to it. So with the 9 minutes I got left and the 9 slides I got left, I want to talk about plants. Kind of just great plants for the native landscape. I'm pausing quickly, so if you want to take a screenshot, you're welcome to, but I'm happy to make this list available. These are just native plants that I find do well. And I always kind of get a little, when someone says, hey, what plant would do well for me in my garden? It's like, well, what is your garden? What is the sun? What is the shade? What are the moisture conditions? That being said, These are the plants that tend to do well, even not knowing what the conditions are. They tend to be the tried and trues. There's others too, but these are some good ones. Let's talk about a few of them. We've already mentioned wild geranium a couple times as a great pollinator plant, as a great plant for caterpillars. We get these lovely purple flowers in the kind of mid to late spring and sometimes reblooming, throughout the summertime. Sometimes coming in this white form, which you can find in the wild somewhat regularly. You can see there a green metallic sweat bee and a little ant hanging out on the flower as well. There's a whole ecosystem forming on these flowers. The foliage of this plant is in itself interesting. This picture on the right is a picture of wild bleeding heart, but look right below it, that's your wild geranium. And these kind of textural leaves I find, are playful in the garden. We've got wild geranium, we've got running foam flower, and we've got bleeding heart there. And you could take the flowers out of that image and you've still got a cool little garden kind of trio going right there. This is the wild geranium in seed. I've always enjoyed this kind of this thing that it does. It builds these little candelabras. It's not pretty in the same standard sense as these flowers are, but it's damn interesting. And then you can even argue beautiful in its design. This is a little catapult that's going to fire seeds off and start new plants for you. My general rule in terms of seeds in the garden is don't deadhead anything unless you have a reason to. I like seeds moving around the garden. They tend to, be better for me than the seeds that move into my garden when I don't want them to. When people ask me for a butterfly bush replacement, this is the first plant that comes to mind. Oh, this is incorrect. This is not meadowsweet. That's Spirea alba. This is steeplebush, Spirea tomentosa. I need to fix that. Steeplebush is a lovely member of our native spireas. These lovely kind of pink flowers that in time go to this kind of bronzy color before eventually drying and often standing right through the winter as this kind of standard dry, cool kind of flower, pedestal. This is it growing under a power line cut. On the left, it's growing in a rain garden. On the right, it's growing in pure sand in full sun. This is a very adaptable shrub. It's also a shrub that can be treated like a perennial in that at any point, you can just cut this thing entirely to the ground and it'll resprout from it. This power line cut is a power line cut. It is mowed every year, and the Spirea is the dominant shrub in that landscape. Wreath goldenrod. Goldenrods get a bad rap. I'm running out of time, so I won't get fully into it, but look it up. Goldenrods do not cause hay fever. That's ragweed. They just bloom at the same time. Goldenrods are the single most valuable ecological herbaceous plant in our region. They support more life than any other forb out there. The only ones that beat them out are the trees and the shrubs. Wreath goldenrod, Cellulocasia here, is one that I absolutely love for the shady sites. This is one that does very well in kind of the woodland edges into dense shade. It's a lovely species that blooms in the axis of the leaves, which is why it sometimes goes by axillary goldenrod, occasionally blue stem goldenrod. You can see a little bit of a blue stem on the left image. It is a phenomenal plant for bees, for caterpillars, and for a variety of other wildlife. And looks great in the fall. I've developed a taste for the fall colors in a way I never did when I first got into gardening. When I first got into gardening, I was looking for the big flashy flowers all the time. And there's nothing wrong with those. I still like a big flashy flower, but there's something beautiful about, browns and grays in the fall season and goldenrod, kind of fluff flying on the wind. It's a more subtle form of beauty, but something that I've developed a real taste for over the past, 10, 15 years. I do an entire lecture on goldenrods and asters. We don't have time for them all this time, so we'll give you one goldenrod, one aster. Bluewood aster, a fantastic species, again, for the kind of woodland edges and into the understories. If you want asters for the full sun, you're going to have to ask me some other time. This is a great species that goes from kind of this white color to a blue color to a purple color. Another one that is fantastic, both for the kind of bees and butterflies in the landscape, and just a hell of a showy plant in the late season. I find a lot of traditional gardens really look great in the summer, but don't have nearly as much going on the kind of ends of the season, whether it be early spring or late fall. If you're thinking late fall and thinking my garden doesn't have enough, look at asters and goldenrods. They are fantastic. I find there are a number of challenges on the landscape that many people deal with. The full sun thin soil is a constant battle for a lot of folks. Normally we think about amending soils. I'm going to tell you today, don't bother amending your soils. Just plant plants that'll grow well in those soils. The other end of the spectrum is the dry acidic shade. Kind of the New England oak pine canopy would definitely count as this. In your region, your pine forest would easily count as that dry acidic shade spots. And wet meadow conditions, something that less people deal with. But for those of you who have kind of consistently moist soils, you'll know that a lot of plants just don't grow well there. Some of them really do. The last kind of challenge that I think is regular on the landscape is these cultural expectations. People see this on the landscape. This is the wrong species in the wrong spot, pruned incorrectly with the worst mulch volcano I've seen in a long time. Everything is wrong with this tree. In fact, this picture is saved in my image database as worst tree ever. It's also a Callery pear, which is an invasive species. So it's just like everything's wrong in this image. And yet people see that regularly. And so if they don't know any better, they see that and they think, well, I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. There's these cultural norms. Lawns are a big part of this. So for my full sun thin soils, these are species that immediately pop into my head. In fact, if you take little blue stem, gray goldenrod, black-eyed Susan, and stiff aster, you've got the start of a garden right there. And then you start adding diversity. The spotted bee balm and the Eurybia spectabilis, that showy aster, could be parts of that. Maybe you could throw a few of the yellow plume grass in there. You've got options now for adding diversity. There's no milkweeds in this garden yet. This is just the base. But it's a great spot, and these plants work very well together. No one of these is going to take over the area. No one of these is going to kind of over dominate the other. You tend to find that the spotted bee balm and the black-eyed Susan are much more prominent in the early stages of a young garden, if these are your choices. And then later on, it's the asters that really show off with this gray goldenrod, which is a lovely short stature species of goldenrod. Really good one for kind of garden settings. The dry acidic shade, I often find myself working with plants that might be, kind of more vigorous and anything more weedy and kind of richer soils. But when I'm talking about challenging conditions, I'm going to work with plants that can handle those conditions. That means if I'm planting a parking lot island, I might be planting staghorn sumac. If I'm working in dry acidic shade, whitewood aster is a go-to for me. This is an aster that I tend to tell people not to plant in kind of richer woodland gardens because it's very vigorous. But in dry acidic shade, it works very well with things like black cohosh, wreath goldenrod, and the bluewood aster. Again, this is just the base. You can add diversity on top of this. Final thing I want to talk about before we open it up to questions is the idea of fall cleanup. On a spectrum to do a whole bunch of fall cleanup to be lazy and don't do anything, I want to give you reasons to be on the be lazy side of things, and then you decide what works well for you. And here are the reasons why. It is often better for plants. If we're talking about a cold but maybe drier winter, or maybe plants that were just planted that fall and may not be fully established, or something that's stressed for other reasons, when winter comes around, that can often be the death knell for the plants. Trying to get as much snow cover covering the base of that plant as possible is a good thing. Snow is a very good insulator, helps to maintain the temperature in the soil. And if we don't have a lot of snow cover, what standing plant material does is it collects snow. And then as things melt and as things get a little softer, that snow travels down that stem, lands at the crown of the plant, and is exactly where we need it to be. I will never understand why we cut back all of the bird seed out of our gardens in fall and then go to the hardware store to buy bird seed. Those standing stems, in this case, wild bergamot, is valuable bird seed, often full of lipids and oils and important nutrients for birds right ahead of the winter time. Not only is it better for the bird populations, but it means you get to see more birds in your fall and winter landscape, which is great. I love seeing birds in the garden. About 2/3 of our native bees nest in the ground over the winter. The remaining third nest in standing herbaceous, some woody stems over the winter. Things like Joe Pye weeds, asters, milkweeds. If we're talking woodies, it's often the raspberries, the rubus genus, and elderberries are important kind of nesting cavities for these animals. You get a lot of bee activity in these. If we're cutting everything down in fall, we're removing that habitat from the space. The butterflies are less consistent. Most of them are overwintering as either caterpillars or eggs or in a chrysalis. Some of them do indeed overwinter as an adult butterfly, though that's pretty uncommon in our region. And most of these are in the leaf litter. So if we rake up all the leaves and put them in the garbage, then that leaf litter is removing that habitat from the garden, often likely removing butterflies from the garden as well. And I like free plants. All that bird seed we left up earlier is getting spread around the garden when it's not going into the bird. And that means next year I'm finding free seedlings. That's Rebecca Herta, Black-Eyed Susan. I love that. I used to pull that plant out of the trails at Garden in the Woods. It would seed into the gravel pathways. I would pull it out, pot it up, give it to the retail folks, or give it to the garden folks to plant out. The last one is really just for us. I like the look of it. It's cool. This is purely an aesthetic choice. A pure white landscape with thimbleweed sticking out of it, and ostrich ferns sticking out of it, and other cool stuff is great. I see birds flittering around in there. I see seeds spreading around in there. I like the look of it. And what I'm getting at with this last point here is I want you to find what works for you. All of today's tips are about kind of doing what works for you. None of it is required. Find what pieces of this make sense in your space. So with that in mind, I actually went over a little bit. It's 8:03, but assuming we're not in any giant rush to get out of here, I will happily take any questions you might have. And thank you all for listening. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Dan, that was quite the tour de force. That was
Thank you.
That was great. I got a couple quick questions myself.
Yeah, what do you got?
You mentioned at the beginning that you plant 50 and hope that 25 make it. This sort of sounds like a Miyawaki forest kind of concept. That you just plant densely and see what competes.
Yeah, I mean, it depends a lot on the situation, what you're trying to accomplish, where you are, all those kind of little details. But the general idea is yes. I'm looking for, I'm trying to find a situation where things will survive. And especially in areas where I'm having trouble, where I'm working in an area where things are a little more challenging, whether it be that dry acidic soil or whether it be the full sun dry or I've got invasives or whatever. If I'm not sure what's going to work, I'm going to overdo it with species because there's a good chance that some of those will make it. I often find myself going into the landscape and saying, I know that this plant is going to do well there, and then it doesn't. And if that's the only plant I put in there, my landscape has failed. But if I put 5 of them in that space where I thought one would do well and one of them fails, I have 4 plants, I have a success. So, throwing that diversity at a space is always a good thing. And you can always kind of, plant 25 different things, see what does well, what looks good to you, and then you start planting more of them from there. It kind of becomes this learning process as you go.
Yeah. And I love your point about, more mulch than plants. That really is crazy. Yeah.
I'm sorry, because now you're never going to be able to turn it off. You're going to see it everywhere.
That's always driving me nuts. Let's see what some questions we've got here. Some people asked right at the beginning, you mentioned the 9,000 acres of high priority, and people were asking, well, how did that happen? And, it's like, I assume just because it's high priority from a nonprofit conservation organization doesn't mean the government has preserved it.
Exactly. Yeah, we can determine that areas are high priority. We can determine that there's rare species or unique habitat or something in an area, but that doesn't stop it from getting developed. That might be a part of the tools. But when it comes down to it, there's a lot more money in developing land than there is in conserving land, and money is an important part of the world we live in. So trying to kind of get away from it is not realistic. Which is part of the reason why I really try and take the realistic approach of not trying to get on top of the no development, and instead get on to the let's identify those habitats that should not be developed. And that means also identifying those areas where, if an area is going to be developed, let's do it over there because we just protected that space. I often tell people at Norcross with 8,000 acres to deal with, we cannot take on every site. I have sites full of invasive species that we are ignoring with purpose because every site we take on is another site we can't take on. So we're going to focus our effort in those high priority areas, that high conservation area, the rare species habitat. We have to prioritize kind of where we put our time and our effort. And that's not just true for me. That's true for all of us in every aspect.
Or somebody asked about your, the lawn alternatives. Are they okay on septic systems? And I would think since you're not planting trees,
Yeah, I mean there are some of when I talked about the not lawns, that's where things start getting pretty crazy, and we could talk about turning a lawn into a full scale forest. That's where things might not work on the septic field. But in general, with just about every herbaceous plant I can think of, with very few exceptions, you can put them on top of a septic field, no problem. The one thing I often recommend is go heavy on the short-lived perennials in those areas, because the septic field should get mowed every year. You want to keep woody species out of a septic field. That's a part of taking care of your septic system. And so that means a lot of disturbance in that area, every year mowing. And with high disturbance, you're not going to get a lot of plants like Baptisia or lupin or these long-lived species. And if you've got a lot of that in the area, they're going to start to decline, and you might get stuff like invasive species and weeds filling in those holes. So instead, a lot of black-eyed Susans, a lot of the spotted bee balm, a lot of the if I've got a septic field that's a little on the kind of moist side, it's a shaded area. I've got a lot of columbine down there and a lot of the cardinal flower down there. You want those species that are very good at doesn't matter when the individual plant dies, because the seed bank is there ready to start all over again. Those are the species I go heavy on in my septic fields.
Yeah, good point. Somebody asked, what's this a picture of that you got up here?
This is not native, at least not in my region. This is the Pacific Northwest. That is somewhere on the side of Mount Rainier, a trip from a couple of years ago. And what you're looking at there is pretty much a heath barren. Low bush blueberry, black huckleberry, at least their versions of what we would have on this coast, which would be low bush blueberry and black huckleberry. This is it's kind of funny because I was a New Englander going out to a part of the country that was not known for phenomenal fall foliage. Their trees don't really give you the fall foliage that New England does, but those heath barrens, they sure do.
That's beautiful. Let's see. Of course, a lot of people have asked, of these various plant, deer resistant.
Deer resistant is always a challenge. And the one kind of caveat I'll give you is no plant is deer proof, and deer definitely have regional preferences and tolerances. So there's certain plants that I find the deer have never touched. And I'll give you a small list of them right now, but keep in mind that that's based in Massachusetts and may not be true for you. So when in doubt, plant a few of them, see how your local deer respond, and then plant more. The spireas that I had up earlier, I had steeplebush, meadowsweet is the one I mislabeled my steeplebush as. That's Spirea alba and Spirea tomentosa. I've never had deer eat those. Your heaths, like in this picture, low bush blueberries, black huckleberries, high bush blueberries, things like that. The deer might eat the berries off them. They don't tend to eat the plants. Those tend to work well for us. Our cherries, our native cherries, there's some shrubby species, there's some trees. Virginia bird cherry is a really nice one that I find is not nearly as often used. That tends to be pretty deer resistant. Serviceberry, they seem to bother it when it's just been planted, that young stage, but after the first season, they tend to leave it alone in favor of other things. Sweet fern is a good one for you. Witch hazel is a good one for you. I would also recommend connecting with the local cooperative extensions. They often have recommendations that are much more regional than this Massachusetts boy trying to talk to you New Jerseyans. Talk to your local garden clubs, talk to your local cooperative extensions, talk to local gardeners and say what's working for you, because that local knowledge is always going to be the best because it's going to be based on your deer.
Yeah, a few people have mentioned Japanese stiltgrass. I mean, you just have to keep pulling it before it goes to seed, right? I mean,
yeah, that one's a pain in the butt. It is an annual, which means that it's very easy to kill the individual plant. You can actually mow that one to control it, but you need to get on top of the seed bank, which is the challenge. So that means making sure that you're mowing it every year so it does not go to seed, and it's going to keep coming up out of the seed bank, and you just keep mowing it until the seed bank's exhausted. Other options for that one would be smothering, laying down either 8 to 10 inches of wood chips, or I find more realistically laying down a layer of a cardboard product and then an inch or two of wood chips on top of that. You can often then plant right into that. And in many cases, what I'll do is I'll actually put a layer of soil on top of it and then wood chips on that. So when you're planting, plant young plugs. Or just soil and then sow your seed on top of it. The idea is you're not going to be piercing the cardboard you put down, and that's going to put that seed bank of the stilt grass below the soil surface, and it will not germinate down there. You just need to keep that in mind, that seed bank's still there. So if you go digging a big hole, you're going to be bringing seed to the surface. But this is, you can smother it out in that manner. On larger scales, you can start using things like silage tarps. They have their own challenges. But for most home landscapes, I find a cardboard kind of smothering process can work very well for a lot of weeds. Japanese stiltgrass being one of them.
Yeah, I've had a lot of luck with the cardboard. I know some people say they don't like the cardboard. They talk about that, 8-inch to a foot of wood chips, and like that's kind of not practical.
Yeah.
My friend wanted to put a foot of wood chips.
Yep. For some small spaces in certain situations, I don't know. I think this exists in your area, but for anyone looking for wood chips, at least in my area, and I believe it's also in Jersey, there's an organization called Chip Drop. It pretty much connects people who want wood chips with arborists who want to find a free place to drop off wood chips. Really nice way to get your hands on free wood chips. Just keep in mind that you get a whole truckload, and then you need to you read the website. It'll give you all the details. But a great place to get wood chips if you actually think you want to do 8 inches of wood chips in an area.
Someone asked about jug-loan tolerant plants for ground cover. I assume that means under the black walnut.
Under the black walnut, yeah. There's actually it's kind of funny if you look at what plants do fine under the black walnut, and you take the list and organize it by native versus non-native. It's like this many native species and that many non-natives. Think about it. Our native species have evolved growing under black walnuts. So a couple really easy ways to find a nice list of this. I believe it's Cornell put out a list a couple of years ago of black walnut resistant species. It's a broad list. You can find it via a quick Google search. It's a really nice one. What I would also recommend is you can go to the most states, including Jersey, have a natural heritage group. It's a state organization, and they will produce community keys, pretty much descriptions of natural communities. Find the natural community that refers to, the black walnut forest, and you will find a list of species that grow underneath black walnuts. Asters, goldenrods, milkweeds, our native sedges grow well underneath them. Blueberries and huckleberries grow well underneath them. Sweet fern grows well underneath them. It's a pretty long list. What doesn't grow good under the black walnuts are pretty much our garden plants like tomatoes and peppers and, a lot of the farming plants and lawns. So in general, if you're working with natives, you'll probably be just fine. But you can find some pretty easy lists through either Cornell, local cooperative extension, or black walnut natural communities.
Let's see here. Covered that. Doing pretty good here. One person says they've planted goldenrod and asters and found them overly aggressive. And wondering if
there's I think there's about 50 different species of goldenrod in the region, and about 30 different species of asters. And that includes some goldenrods that are extremely aggressive and probably should not be planted in gardens. That includes some goldenrods that I've struggled for years to grow and not succeeded with. And it includes a number of species in what we'll call the Goldilocks zone, vigorous enough to not be a delicate thing, but not so vigorous that they're problematic. And those are the goldenrods you want to work with. Downy goldenrod, wreath goldenrod, gray goldenrod, fantastic species. There's some other ones out there. In terms of the asters, smooth aster is one I go to often. Blue wood aster is a really good option. Showy aster is a fantastic one. What you're going to want to do is find the right species for you. Roughleaf goldenrod, Canada goldenrod, giant goldenrod, whitewood aster, these are all very vigorous. These are the sort of plants I plant when I'm dealing with an old agricultural site that's full of invasives, or planting on my roadside or in a parking lot island. That's where I want those vigorous species. But those vigorous species are probably not the best choice for most garden settings. So really the trick is, don't lump all goldenrods or all asters together. Find the species that'll work well for you. And there's likely, 5 or 6 of them.
Yeah. Somebody's like, what would compete with Japanese knotweed? I mean,
unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way. If we had a plant that was strong enough to compete with Japanese knotweed wouldn't be a problem. What you can do, and I think what the question is getting at is kind of how to deal with knotweed beyond just the what do I do sort of thing, or just to say I'll hit it with herbicide. What I find is the most important part and the overlooked part of invasive species management is working with the native species in that same area. And that means as I'm working on removing the invasive species, such as the knotweed, I'm also working on establishing the most vigorous native species I possibly can to push back. Because, you know, staghorn sumac will not outcompete Japanese knotweed. But if I have staghorn sumac, you know, and Japanese knotweed in the same area, and I am actively removing the Japanese knotweed, then the staghorn sumac will win that battle because I am that X factor, that extra piece. And that's what I often find myself doing. You know, when I'm working in post-invaded sites, I'm working with the vigorous native species that we don't tend to put in gardens. That is roughleaf goldenrod, that is staghorn sumac, that's common milkweed, that's all of those very vigorous plants. And I'm actively removing the invasive species. And that varies greatly. You know, we don't have time for all the various different ways you can go about it. It can be smothering, it can be herbicide, it can be, we use propane torches on barberry. And when you bring the native in is going to depend on how you're removing the invasive. Sometimes it's a little bit of a kind of scorched earth policy where you're just trying to remove everything and then you plant the natives. Other times it's a process of getting the natives in there and removing individual invasive plants while continuing to work around and encourage the natives. And that comes down to a lot of details based on your site.
Well, here in New Jersey, we have the invasive species strike team that's part of the Friends of Hopewell Valley.
That's good to hear. We don't have anything like that in my area. We all just figure it out ourselves.
And they have tons of information about how to handle each different invasive species.
That sounds like a fantastic resource. Go look that up, question asker, if you don't know that one already.
I think we're winding down here. One thing, like, what is the best time to put seed mix down? I would think in the fall, because if they need stratification.
That's the key right there. It depends on what they need. You know, if it's a mix, usually the fall, because there's almost certainly going to be stuff in there that needs cold stratification, and most of our native plants do. And by cold stratification, we mean cold and moist. So you can't just take that seed, you know, pack it and stick it in the fridge. It needs to be moist. So you lay it down in fall, and winter does the work for us. There's some species that don't need that. Little blue stem is a big one that doesn't need the cold period, actually does better with a spring sowing. Partridge pea does better with a spring sowing. So if you're doing a single species, look up what that species needs and base your sowing based on the individual species. If you're doing a seed mix, do it in fall. Even the species that do better in spring will be perfectly fine being sown in fall, getting through the winter, assuming we're talking about natives, they'll come up in spring. There's even some seeds that require 2 winters to germinate, but that's a whole different question.
Well, Dan, thank you. This has been great.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for organizing and taking care of all the technical stuff and the questions. Thank you all who listened in. Love seeing these numbers. I'm looking at 178 participants, which is fantastic to see. I hope you all got something out of there. Go out there and plant some more native plants.
Okay, and keep up the good work you do.
Hey, much appreciated. I'll talk to you all again next time.
Take care. Bye.